Okay, Carly, could you please just state your full name and your position at Concordia?
Yeah, so I'm Carly Ziter, and I'm an urban ecologist and an assistant professor in the biology department at Concordia University.
Thank you so much. So in regards to your thesis about how can we manage green spaces to benefit both people and conserve
Mhm.
biodiversity, is there anything you've come across in your research that is very prevalent to the situation in Montreal that you think is worth mentioning?
Yeah, so in terms of just generally kind of conserving biodiversity and protecting people, so green spaces are incredibly important in our cities for both conserving biodiversity and providing benefits to people. And so often when people think of urban green spaces, they think of large parks like, Mont Royal or Parc La Fontaine. Those are important, but those are not the only green spaces we have in our cities. And so when we consider green spaces, we think about everything from, parks to backyards to street trees to these informal green spaces that maybe are former vacant lots or are waiting for development. And together, these provide benefits for people in terms of, direct health and safety, things like reducing heat waves in the summer, reducing flooding, improving air quality. But they also provide incredible benefits in terms of our kind of access to nature, access to recreation, mental health. At the same time, they're conserving biodiversity. So they're allowing space for us to share our cities with other kinds of wildlife. They're providing space and resources, for birds that we love to listen to, for bees that pollinate our plants, for all kinds of wildlife that are here with us.
Thank you very much. What are your thoughts on, Montreal wanting to plant 500,000 trees by 2030 and, become at the same time by 2030 reduce emissions by 55%? Do you think that this is attainable, and do you think that this is a good goal?
I think it's a great goal. I think it is attainable, but it will take some work and it will take some change that people, there may be some resistance to the kinds of changes it takes, particularly to reduce emissions by that amount. But it is really essential. I mean, we're seeing the effects of climate change firsthand. Even this summer, we've been seeing, wildfires in Quebec that we're not used to. We've been feeling the effects of that in Montreal in terms of our air pollution. These should be, warning signs to people that we need to reduce our emissions and we need to take fairly drastic steps to do so. Planting trees is wonderful. I'm an urban ecologist. I'm obviously very in support of planting trees, but I think it's really important that people understand that planting trees on its own is not enough. We can't, plant our way out of climate change and its impacts. We need to do it at the same time as reducing emissions. We also need to be thinking about retaining the mature trees that we already have in our cities, because the benefits that these trees provide, particularly benefits like temperature regulation, flood regulation, that are very closely tied to a changing climate, really scale with the size of a tree. So you can imagine, standing next to a very small tree that's not doing very much in terms of shading or reducing temperature compared to a nice, tall, mature shade tree. And so planting new trees is great, but it's going to take decades for those trees to be able to provide the benefits that we're already getting from the trees we have now. And so I would really like to see as much attention paid to retaining and properly caring for and managing the trees we have now alongside planting new ones.
I'm glad that you mentioned protecting mature trees. In terms of the story I'm working on about development
Mhm.
in Technopark, uh, both by Hypertech, the company that wants to build their
Mhm.
headquarters, and the REM, they need to move a significant amount of trees to develop. But both of them have separately promised to either relocate the trees or ones that are lost, what they call compromise. So plant new trees. Do you think that this has kind of the removal of mature trees not only has an impact on retaining carbon, but has an impact on biodiversity, especially a place that is home to so many species?
Absolutely. So a space like the Technopark is home to incredible biodiversity. It's what we could consider a biodiversity hotspot within Montreal, particularly when we think about the number of bird species that have been documented there. It's a really important space for birds to stop over on their migratory journey. And there are a number of other important species that use that habitat as well. And so a reduction in trees or in land or kind of fragmentation of that space where we're, chopping it up into pieces can definitely be detrimental to biodiversity. Ideally, it would be the ideal situation for businesses or companies or infrastructure projects in general to build in areas that are not currently green. So not to displace green space or habitat for biodiversity in order to increase built cover. If that can't happen, and I understand that it's, these are complicated situations, often these buildings will go in. If that is the case, it's really important that these companies take responsibility to remediate as best they can the damage that they're causing to biodiversity. And so that could be through moving trees, through planting new trees, through offsetting that habitat somewhere else. Again, best case scenario, you leave your green space green to begin with, but as a second best, restoring that land or other land is an option. I think in those cases, it's really important that businesses or the city, works directly with ecologists, with conservation biologists to understand, what they can be planting to have the most positive impact.
Would you know if this is already happening, if the city is working alongside biologists?
Certainly in many cases, I mean, the city does have their own biologists on staff as well. There is an Office of Biodiversity, and so there is a fair amount of collaboration. In terms of private companies and private development, it's really a case-by-case basis. Some are very good about kind of reaching out and working with ecologists or with ecological or environmental consultants, others less so. I think that as we see the city working towards targets like, protecting 30% of the Greater Montreal area for biodiversity or putting in place things like pollinator protection plans, as we see more attention paid to the importance of urban biodiversity at the municipal level, I hope that will translate into stronger, pressure or incentives for companies to really be developing with biodiversity in mind.
Thank you.
Not always the case, unfortunately, but hopefully we're moving in the right direction.
Thank you. Just kind of moving back to trees specifically, and the reduction of CO2 emissions. How impactful are trees at reducing CO2 emissions?
Yeah, so trees do store carbon. Trees everywhere sequester and store carbon, which helps with climate change mitigation. Trees in our cities do this just like trees elsewhere, but due to the sheer kind of land areas involved, the carbon stock in cities is small relative to the amount of carbon we would see, for example, in our northern forests. So areas that are affected by wildfires right now, for example, are extremely important in storing carbon, and that carbon is being released. We can capture carbon in cities. And when it comes to climate change mitigation, to storing carbon, every bit counts. And so increasing these, we often call them nature-based solutions in our cities, is important. But where I think urban trees are actually more important is for climate change adaptation. So yes, trees will store carbon that will help in the larger picture of reducing climate change, but they're really important as well in helping us to adapt or to kind of adjust to this new abnormal. And that's because trees don't only store carbon, they also reduce temperature significantly during heat waves. This is a big problem in cities as climate changes. They can improve air quality, again, another challenge linked to climate change, um, by removing particulate pollutants, other air pollutants. And they also provide, increased quality of life. And so it's these multiple benefits that I think we need to be thinking of with our urban trees. If we only think of them in terms of their capacity to store carbon, then we're discounting a lot of the good that they do in cities. And we may come to the conclusion that, oh, well, we should just plant them elsewhere if all they're doing is storing carbon. But for these other benefits like temperature regulation, air pollution regulation, flooding regulation, those trees need to be in close proximity to people for us to benefit in that way. And so in those ways, having trees in and among where we live and where we work is really critical.
Thank you. Is there any sort of estimate to maybe how many trees we might need in Montreal to, keep the island cool, or this is going to be a massive number, but regulate our carbon levels?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't have a number for you off the top of my head. Often when we're thinking about trees, we're not necessarily thinking about like number of individuals. We do think about that when we're planting, right? Because when you have a target for planting, you are planting each tree, so you count each tree. When we're thinking in terms of the benefits provided, we more often think of things like canopy cover. So if you were like looking down at Montreal from an airplane, how much of your view is covered by the leaves of trees? Or if you're looking straight up, is there canopy overhead? And that is because the canopy cover correlates more closely with a lot of these benefits like temperature regulation, because it's taking into account not just the number of trees, but also, their size, how they're spaced out. And so there are different levels of canopy cover that we might aim for different benefits, but there is research that has shown levels like 30 to 40% canopy cover within a neighborhood can be really important for reducing temperature, for providing other benefits. It's also important that we think of not just the total number of trees in the city or the total, canopy cover, but the distribution. And so if we have, for example, all of our trees in wealthy areas of the city, or all of our trees in a particular geographic area of the city, that's going to provide these important benefits to some people, but leave others without. So one of the really important targets as the city thinks about increasing tree planting and, planting those new trees is increasing the equity of tree cover and access to trees. So ensuring that neighborhoods that have been historically low canopy or have limited access to trees and green spaces are prioritized for planting, so that we can even the playing field when it comes from, who has access to these really important benefits.
That's important to consider. Yeah, especially
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say it's often discussed in terms of green equity, or sometimes you'll hear tree equity. And often it's the areas with the lowest tree cover in Montreal, as in many cities, tend to be areas that are home to equity deserving populations, that are home to lower income communities, racialized communities, new immigrants. And these are often the same parts of the city where people may have less access to other ways of adapting to climate change or weathering extreme events. So for example, there may be less access to air conditioning, less access to other ways to cool off, more kind of built infrastructure or higher density of buildings that increases the temperature further. And so not only are you living in a hotter part of the city with less access to air conditioning, but you don't have the trees or the green infrastructure that would allow you to cool off either. And so it's really an issue of environmental injustice. And so when we hear about, planting trees or where or how many, it's important that we consider, in which areas of the city we're planting as well as that total number.
Would you be willing to maybe name a few neighborhoods that you feel could benefit from greater tree canopy or don't have as much access to green spaces?
Yeah, there are some good maps available, and I'm trying to think, there was an article, I think in the Globe and Mail last year or the year before, that had some really striking images. And I think places where it's really obvious are where we see these kinds of juxtapositions between wealthier and less well-off neighborhoods. So for example, if you compare the town of Mount Royal to neighboring Park Extension, there's a stark difference in the amount of tree cover in those areas. When you compare Westmount and NDG with Côte des Neiges, you see kind of a stark disparity in the tree cover in a neighborhood like Côte des Neiges compared to neighboring Westmount or neighboring NDG. There are certainly parts of the east end of Montreal tend to have lower tree cover and also kind of lower socioeconomic communities than parts of the West Island. And so I won't go through and give a list of neighborhoods, but if you think about parts of the city that tend to be lower income, that tend to be home to more racialized communities, there is a good chance that those communities are also low in tree cover. This is something that the city and other organizations have been making a really strong effort to address, but it's something that also takes time and money to solve that problem, because we need to go in and plant the trees, which in some cases may involve things like removing pavement to have the space to plant them. And then we also need to give those trees time to grow. It's not something that you can, snap your fingers and have a mature tree canopy.
I'm sure this is a big topic, but without kind of taking too much of your time, could you explain a little bit about the impact of the wildfires in Quebec in terms of how vital these forests are in holding on to carbon and the carbon that is being emitted with the fires?
Yeah, I can explain a little bit. You'd want to talk to someone who's more of an expert on wildfire as well to get a more concrete perspective on this. But in general, so in many parts of the country, wildfire is a natural occurrence. It's something that we expect, but with climate change, we're seeing larger and more intense fires, and we're seeing them in areas that we wouldn't normally expect to burn, or more frequently than we would expect. So we're seeing an increase in wildfire activity driven in large part by climate change. And when these areas burn, they are releasing large amounts of carbon from the trees that burn, and in many cases also from the soils that are holding huge amounts of carbon. Now that carbon, can be recaptured as these forests start to grow again, but that's a process that will take a large amount of time, and not all of these areas will regrow in the same way after fire, particularly with changing conditions. And so we're seeing a huge release of carbon throughout Quebec, throughout Canada right now with our current kind of unprecedented wildfires in the area. We're also seeing changes in air quality that are affecting not only the regions that are burning, but many cities that are far from these areas, because those particulate pollutants are carried a long distance. And so, we're seeing changes in air quality in Montreal. We're seeing changes in air quality throughout Southern Ontario, throughout the Northeastern United States as a result of these wildfires. And that has obvious, health effects and implications as well.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining that. I'll try to just keep it at one more question, just because I'm sure you have to go soon. Okay, that's best to ask. I guess
someone, if you just, in case you want a name for the wildfire, someone who would be really useful to talk to is Jan Boulanger, who works for, I can put the name in the chat if that's easier, but he works for NRCan as a forest ecologist, but he knows a lot about the wildfire situation in Quebec and those impacts, and would be a really great person to talk to.
That's amazing. Available. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that. Okay, I guess the last thing I want to ask is, you mentioned it a little bit before, but in terms of the removal of trees and replanting of trees, I know that you kind of identified, the size of the tree and the impact that mature trees have. But an environmentalist in Technopark that I was speaking to, she and other people, part of her groups, had concern about how nature will kind of readapt to their ecosystem being kind of shifted and moved, citing a parking lot that was built near the airport, and milkweed fields were removed. Monarch butterflies were affected, milkweeds were relocated, but the monarchs haven't quite taken to it as they were before. Is this something to keep in mind with trees and species that do utilize trees, especially in Technopark?
Yeah, absolutely. So although it would be great if we could, we can't really just like pick up an ecosystem and move it. There are an incredible number of, moving parts in terms of a natural ecosystem, from, the soil to the vegetation to the, insects that feed on that vegetation, the birds that feed on the insects. You have a whole food web there. And yes, we can replant particular species somewhere else, but that doesn't mean that we have reconstructed that former ecosystem. So restoring an area is quite difficult. It takes time and expertise and also some luck to ensure that we kind of recapture what we had previously. So we should continue to try to restore areas, but it's not necessarily a sure solution to recapture something that was lost, for example, through development or through building. And so the easiest thing to do, the most affordable thing to do, is to leave the ecosystems where they are, leave the green spaces where they are, and build elsewhere. Because once you build, it becomes much more difficult and time-consuming and expensive to try and kind of recreate that ecosystem you've lost elsewhere. And it may not turn out the same. You may not recapture, the same species, the same community of creatures you had in that space before. So certainly that is a big challenge. And it's very easy to say, oh, well, we're cutting down X number of trees, so we'll replant X number of trees elsewhere, but that doesn't fully capture the types of change and loss that may be happening in that space. It's still a good start. I think, if we're removing nature, if we're removing habitat for species, we should be doing our best to remediate those effects and to either replant on site or replant elsewhere, but it's not trivial to recapture a natural ecosystem.
We can't really play God and expect for it to work out in our favor, I guess.
Exactly. I think there are many cases where, you'll see examples, oh, well, we drained this wetland and built, so then we put in an artificial wetland over here. And that wetland, the new one, doesn't have the same functions, the same species, the same biodiversity as what was previously lost. We see this with many types of ecosystems. And it's because nature is incredibly complex. We just don't yet have, the knowledge and the expertise to fully replicate that. And it's expensive in terms of money, but also in terms of time, in terms of resources to recreate something that we've already had. And so wherever we can in the city, retaining high value green spaces as they are is the preferred course of action ecologically.
Thank you so much. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you'd like to share or think is important to consider?
I think we covered things. I think that we did talk a little bit about this, but making sure that the kind of core thing that we need to do, alongside the tree planting and the restoration and the all of these things we talked about, is reducing emissions. Many of these problems we're seeing in terms of wildfires, in terms of increased heat, in terms of increased flooding, are a result of climate change. And so it's not enough to just adapt to this changing situation. We also need to reduce our emissions if we want livable cities in the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you speaking with me so early and just making the time. It's such a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. And if you have follow-up questions or something wasn't clear, just send me an email and then we can clarify that way.
Wonderful. I really appreciate that. Thank you again. And I will be in touch with the release. And if you have any questions for me, don't hesitate to let me know.
Great.
Wonderful.
Have a nice day.
Have a wonderful day, Carly. Take care. Bye.